Hi, welcome back to Truthloader, and this is the latest in our series of live interviews called The Truth According to. And today we have Simon Counsell joining us from the foundation, Rainforest Foundation UK, who's come in to talk to us about the project and the work that you do, mapping rights. But first of all, let's get back to basics. Let's just talk about what the Rainforest Foundation is, what it stands for, and yeah, let's take it from there.
Sure. So the Rainforest Foundation works to support the local communities living in and around the world's tropical rainforests. We believe that the best way of protecting those rainforests is to help those local communities, and especially the native tribes living in those areas, to protect their own environment. And often we do this by strengthening supporting their rights to fend off invasions by loggers or mining companies or cattle ranchers or whatever it might be. We've been doing this for the last 25 years, and it's proven to be extremely effective. In that time, we have helped to protect an area of rainforest about 100,000 square kilometres, so that's getting on for the size of England, which for a fairly small charity is pretty good going. And in fact, we were pioneering really in that kind of work, you know, taking a rights-based approach to this kind of work, a people-based approach to it. But over those last 2 decades or so, it's been recognised that this is one of the most effective way of protecting forests, rather than putting a fence around them and trying to keep people out, is actually to keep people in them and looking after their own local environment.
Just tell us some sort of like simple facts about the work that you do, because a lot of what organisations do are based around trying to engage with people, and to do that, you have to tell them information in a way that they can manage it and they can take it in. So, I suppose some people might say, "Oh, give us some top lines of, you know, what do we know has an effect."
Sure. Well, I suppose one of the important things to bear in mind is that the future of the tropical rainforest is something that affects everybody on the planet. Half of all the species on the planet are believed to exist in tropical rainforest. There are varying statistics that suggest that some dozens, perhaps, of those species are becoming extinct every single day because of the destruction of rainforests. The rainforests are the home to, well, it's not entirely sure, but somewhere between 500 million and 1 billion people that depend on the forests for their natural foods, for natural medicines, for water, for land to grow their crops and so on. Tropical rainforests are also important in terms of regulating global climate and weather patterns. The destruction of rainforests is the cause of about 1/8 of all the greenhouse gas emissions that humankind is putting into the atmosphere. And of course, it's a serious question about the rights of people living in those forests. They have human rights to carry on existing in their own homelands, as they have done in many cases for thousands of years. So I think for all of those reasons, these are things that touch us all, basically, and globally. And how would we feel, for example, if somebody decided to drive a bulldozer through our house tomorrow? This is the kind of thing that actually happens to people living in tropical rainforest areas the whole time. And one of the things about the Rainforest Foundation is that as a small charity, we can be extremely effective with relatively small amounts of support, because we amplify that support that's given by people in richer countries, usually by working with these local communities that themselves are strongly motivated often to protect their own environment.
You touched on there sort of the problems that indigenous people face in these countries where you work. So you were talking sort of about bulldozing through homes, you know, for construction or for maybe financial gain, you might sort of say. But I mean, the problems that indigenous people face, I suppose, aren't necessarily just that. I mean, there are consequences as well, I suppose.
Well, yes. In Africa, for example, which is where we at the Rainforest Foundation UK do most of our work, despite the fact that there are somewhere between 50 and 100 million people living in the great equatorial rainforests of the Congo region of Central Africa, almost none of those people have any rights whatsoever to the land that they live on. Despite having been there in many cases in these communities for some thousands of years, and evidently protecting the forest rather well. So it's possible for the governments in those countries to simply hand out the land, the forest that they're living in, to a logging company that will clear the forest for timber or damage the forest very badly, taking the timber out, to a palm oil company, which is increasingly a problem in Africa, whereby the entire forest would be cleared, and therefore the people living there already would entirely lose their livelihoods. They would be evicted. They would have to move off, probably become squatters or beggars in a city or some other fate like that. They tend to be heavily discriminated against in the law, in effect. They usually have very, very little access to health, to education. In fact, these are the poorest people in the very poorest countries in the world. So you can only imagine, I think, how powerless they really are to defend themselves against these really much more powerful forces that are trying to take their land and take the resources that they depend on.
It must feel really strange when you're talking about rights and human rights. You know, if you live in a country where you have a property or you have land that you've bought or you just live it somewhere, it's not something that you necessarily have to think about on a daily basis. So I mean, the rights of where you live, the legal rights, things like that. So indigenous people in these kind of situations, they don't even know anything. Is that
well, exactly right. So, and you're right to say that we in Western countries in particular are absolutely used to the sense of property, of ownership. You know, we live in a house, we either own it or we have some kind of lease agreement over it. It's recognised by the law. The law will defend us if someone tries to take that away from us. We can identify on a map, for example, or a plan of an area which is our property. None of these things are true for people living in tropical rainforest areas, often, especially in Africa. The communities, of which, as I say, there are many tens of thousands, consisting of many millions of people. In many cases, they're not even on the maps, the official maps that the government has. The areas that they depend on, traditionally they use for hunting or gathering or growing crops or collecting medicines or whatever. These are never shown on maps. In many senses, they officially don't exist. Many of these people don't even they're not given birth certificates at birth, therefore they can't get national identity papers, therefore they can't have access to the state services such as health or education or justice. You know, in many ways they simply don't exist. And the governments, unfortunately, in some of those countries often treat them as if they don't exist and ignore their presence and take their land for whatever purposes they deem fit. So that's a very difficult thing, I think, for some of us to get our minds around, if you like, that when we do take some of these very, very basic rights of our society for granted, and say, well, if I had absolutely no rights whatsoever and I didn't exist, how would that feel? That's how you have to try and feel to understand how some forest people in Africa experience the world.
You touched on the government and sort of what happens with them, and I want to come to that in a little while, but let's just talk about the mapping rights, the projects that you do. Can you sort of give us an idea of sort of the processes of that, you know, the difficulties you face out in the field, and if there's any particular instances which you or your staff have found which have been particularly shocking? Sure.
Yes, so I was saying that many of the people that we work with, they don't exist officially, and their settlements, their villages, the lands the forests that they use don't exist on maps. Well, one of the things that we've found extremely powerful over the years has been to help those communities to actually make the maps of where they live. It's a technique that's been used for several decades, actually, and some of the best protected areas of rainforest in the world, in countries such as Brazil, for example, have started by the indigenous tribes, local communities, mapping the areas that they use, that they rely on for their subsistence, and then taking those maps to the government and say, hey, look, this is us, this is where we are. We we've been here for many thousands of years, and we demand some rights to protect this forest and stop it being given away to people that would destroy it. Well, with the Rainforest Foundation UK, we've been trying to do the same kind of thing, and successfully, in the Congo Basin rainforests of Africa, working with many hundreds of communities, actually over many millions of acres of forest, training those communities up in starting with fairly basic mapping techniques. You even draw maps in the dirt on the ground, but you get the whole village around to show which bits of forest they're using, which they depend on, where the best resources are, where they protect wildlife and so on, where the sacred sites are. So, there's very often very strong cultural attachment with the forest, including specific cultural practices and specific spirits and so on that live in the forest and bits of the forest. You can map all of these with local communities, and then over a period of maybe a week or so, with our expert mapping technicians and with local community mappers that we train up, advance to really sophisticated mapping techniques, digital mapping techniques, using GPS, geographical positioning systems. They're a bit like sat-navs, only kind of in reverse. You can make your own maps based on satellite positioning, very accurate satellite positioning. We can do these, use these techniques with communities over a period of maybe a week or so, and covering many thousands of acres of rainforest, showing exactly where those communities are, where the important bits of forest are. And then moving on from that, help ensure with all of the community that we've got exactly the right areas of forest demarcated. We can print the maps out in the villages, show them, get people to agree this, and then they basically have a map that they can take to the authorities and say, this is, this is us. We demand some rights over this area that we've traditionally inhabited. I mean, it's been used in many cases already to strengthen the rights of people, and often where communities are facing very serious restrictions on their livelihoods by strict conservation projects like national parks. It may sound a little odd to some of the viewers that conservation should be a problem, but in some cases it can be, because local communities tend to be considered as part of the problem. They are the ones that supposedly are hunting wildlife. Well, in some cases they are hunting wildlife because that's what they live on, that's their subsistence. But in what we think is very often a flawed approach to conservation, the fences go up, the eco guards come in, often heavily armed, and local communities can suffer serious prohibitions on the use of the forest that they have actually been using and protecting for hundreds or thousands of years. We've been able to use the mapping techniques that I was just describing in a number of cases to help show to the local authorities, and particularly the nature conservation agencies, that actually, hey, look, these people have been using this area for a long time. There's still lots of wildlife here for sure. Work with these people, respect some of their rights to this land, rather than excluding them from the national park and therefore making enemies of them. And this seems to work very well, and it's increasingly recognised that this is the way forward for long-term sustainable protection of forests. Work with communities, not against them. And the mapping is a very good way of helping to kind of reconcile those different approaches.
When you sort of completed a part of your mapping process in a particular country or part of a country, and you go to the authorities and you say, here is an area, here's how many people live there, you know, look at this and respect where they live. Do they actually listen to you? Because governments effectively govern and may say, well, this is the country that we govern.
It's a very good question, and frankly the first response is often one of suspicion. It's surprising. We've known examples in parts of Cameroon, for example, where there are many indigenous pygmy people living, where local officials, even a few miles out of the forest in the local town, they have never ever visited or been in a pygmy community. These are government officials. They won't necessarily even accept that these communities exist. As I say, they're not officially recorded, and if they've not been seen, well, who are the officials to believe that they exist or not? So it's often, in the first instance, a case of persuading officials, politicians, that all we're really doing is acknowledging the existence of some of their citizens. It's as simple as that. And then proceeding from that basis, it's often helpful to take government officials with us on these missions into these sometimes fairly remote areas of forest to help show that these people aren't necessarily dangerous, and they are capable of doing quite sophisticated technical exercises, such as generating these maps of their own territories. And it helps to build a sense of trust, where often in the past, I think forest peoples, especially indigenous peoples, have often really been regarded as well, in some cases, not even quite human, to be honest. I mean, they're often treated at best as second-class citizens. So what we try to do is encourage a better understanding by the government officials that control these areas, in theory, that these people are real people, have real demands and needs, and are people that can actually be worked with.
So the approach works, albeit maybe it takes a bit of time. I mean,
yeah.
You talk about a particular country or area where it's...
Sure, it's bound to take a bit of time, and we're talking about years, not months, and it really depends. I think in our experience of having done this work for, nearly 20 years in the Congo Basin countries, I think attitudes are definitely starting to change a little bit. Indigenous forest people are probably treated with less contempt and or suspicion than they were 20 years or so ago. I think the processes that we've been leading have helped that by showing that they're technically capable. They can, in fact, when they do obtain their national identity cards and become proper state citizens, if you like, they act as proper state citizens. So there has been an improvement in that, but there's still a very, very long way to go. I mean, in some countries, I suppose if one were to identify a particular country, I mean, Gabon, for example, has particularly strict policies about nature conservation, and has had a fairly brutal approach to evicting local communities from rainforest national parks, for example, has pretty bad relations with the indigenous peoples living in and around those forest areas, and still has a way to go, I think, in learning that, as we would see it, working with people is better than against them.
And the team's going back out there it's sort of later this year? Or?
Yes, well, we have teams pretty much in the field, in the forest the whole time, really. So our experts coming in and out of London do so every few months or so, for a few months at a time often. Some of these areas take a long time to get to because they are pretty remote. So they're spending a few weeks or months helping local organisations, local charities to develop these mapping techniques, and then to work with the local communities, training up local mappers, training up local lawyers as well in the field. So yeah, so we have a presence there the whole time. But of course, it's the local organisations that we work with. I mean, they're there the whole time, of course. And what's really fundamental to our approach, and again, it's different from the way that other conservation organisations work, is that we don't really like to have this kind of parachute in experts and expats view on things, and we rather, well, we believe that ultimately it's going to be down to the people in Africa or South America to protect the forests themselves, and so we do a lot of work and put a lot of resources into helping local African or Peruvian organisations, often indigenous peoples organisations, to be capable of running these kinds of projects and fighting these kinds of battles for themselves.
What's it like for your team, the people who are part of your team abroad, and they go into a community and maybe they meet them for the first time, and it's the start of the process? I mean, what's it like for them?
Well, our team's pretty used to this kind of thing. They've done it many scores or hundreds of times even. Every experience can be slightly different. You never know quite what you're going to find when you arrive in a village. Usually the way that we work is that one of the local organisations that we work with that's based in the country. They will often know the local language. They may have built up some kind of connections with these remote communities over the years. It can take a long time even just to build up the trust to work with some of these remote villages and these remote peoples over several months, basically, just to get them to understand who we are and what we're interested in trying to do with them, what they stand to gain from it, exactly what the problems are that they are facing. Is it a logging company? Is it the local national park that's the problem? Is someone trying to steal their land for cattle ranching or whatever it might be? So, and because the cultures are extremely different, very different ways of working. Very often in the African Congo Basin countries that we work in, there's generally very few people in the villages that can write. The culture is very much a verbal and oral culture. Information is transferred from generation to generation by storytelling. It can be extremely discursive ways around describing what the situation is there. The concepts of time itself can be quite interesting, with often history and memory of what happened in the past based on say relationships to when someone was alive, some relation was alive, or some relation died, for example. These kind of histories, if you like, which is always important to understand, to know what's really happened to this community and this forest in the past. Sometimes these histories can get concertinaed into short spaces of time that don't actually make sense. So these kind of cultural differences can be quite challenging to kind of reconcile and to understand from our perspective what is really important to this community, and then get them to help them. But as I say, we've had quite a lot of experience of it, and I think we do that quite well.
What is your personal opinion about all of this? You know, you've been in the field quite a few times. You know, you've seen this. Yeah, I mean, why do you do this? Why are you part of the Rainforest Foundation?
Well, it's been my personal working life for pretty much all of my working life, actually. So it's been more than 25 years now. I've been passionate about protecting rainforests, but passionate about protecting the rights of people as well. I genuinely feel I've seen many examples whereby, for the sake of conservation and for the benefit of rich countries, basically, and people who rightly care about wildlife in the rainforests, some pretty horrible things have been done to local people, and I personally find myself extremely motivated not to let that happen in the future, and I do believe that there are ways of reconciling the interests of protecting the wildlife in the rainforest, and also protecting the well-being of the people that are living there and are amongst the most disempowered people on the planet. So that, I think, is my personal motivation.
Okay. We're here with Simon Counsell from the Rainforest Foundation UK, talking about mapping rights for indigenous people, mainly in African countries. So if you want to get your questions in, just comment down the side of this video or tweet us at Truthloader, and we will try and throw your questions to Simon in a while. You mentioned before about the Congo Basin. This is one of your projects that you're doing that it's going to take a while. Can you tell us sort of a bit more about that? What you hope to get out of that, and how it's going to proceed?
Yeah, sure. So I was saying earlier that we've been working with several hundred communities there to help them map their territories, put those communities literally on the map, and start to build a case for them to have rights to protect that rainforest. The Congo Basin, it's fortunately been spared the kind of mass destruction that we've seen in other countries, including Brazil and Indonesia, and so on. There's other areas of rainforest that have been destroyed very, very rapidly. It hasn't yet happened quite so badly in the Congo Basin. There have been growing signs in recent years that it's about to happen. The logging industry in the Congo could expand extremely quickly. We've managed to keep that threat back for the last 10 years or so. But the governments in those countries are understandably looking to bring in foreign investment. They want to exploit their mineral resources. It's an extremely rich area in natural resources, not just timber, but gold, diamonds, iron, aluminium, it's all there waiting to be extracted. All of which would cause a lot of damage to the rainforest. They would have to build roads, a lot of railways, ports, other infrastructure, and all of this is potentially going to threaten the as yet reasonably existing rainforest areas. A lot of it has been exploited partially for timber. We're concerned about what happens to those areas once the loggers have been through. Often they will become kind of open for people to move in and clear for agriculture once the roads have been built in by the logging companies. So there are some latent threats in the Congo Basin. What we're trying to do is expand this Mapping for Rights program out from the areas that we've done so far, and I say we've worked with several hundred communities. That actually only covers about 2 or 3% of the entire Congo Basin. We'd like to get to something more like 7 or 10%, maybe 5 million hectares of Congo Basin forest mapped within the next 3 or 4 years or so. And by doing that, give the local communities in the forest the first tool that they need. For example, to establish a community forest, which there is now the legal possibility of doing in at least 3 of the Congo Basin countries. So communities can get together, they take their maps, they take various other bits of information to the government, say, hey, we want this area designated as an area which we manage and is legally established. That area can't then be given over to a logging company or a mining company or whatever it might be. So that's the program that we aim to run in the next few years, is greatly expanding out the Mapping for Rights program that we have. We've got to train a lot more mappers, probably several scores more mappers, many more hundreds of community mappers. We need to train up probably some more dozens of community lawyers to help communities fight these kind of these legal battles that they need to go through to protect their forests. So that's the program for the next few years.
Okay, you mentioned before about how being a small charity, there are numerous charities out there where you could donate to, and I'm not suggesting that yours should be the one that the only one that people donate to, but I mean, you must face difficulties. There must be a kind of a battle for people's thoughts and sort of getting into their head that this is a cause that they should take an interest and they should follow, because you have the donate button on your website, like every other charity who is maybe sort of online savvy, social media savvy and all of that. But how does that play out for you?
Oh, well, it's extremely competitive for all charities, especially in the UK where we're based. There are many hundreds of thousands of charities competing for public attention and funds. British public is incredibly generous, of course, in giving to charities and supporting many worthy causes. There are lots of good causes out there. They all have their place. Actually, we work with a lot of other charities ourselves. Often the kind of work that we do, we can't win the battles. They're simply too big for a small organisation like ours. But we do amplify our efforts by working not only with local communities, but also with other greenish organisations or human rights organisations. So I think this is one of the reasons why I think we've been well supported actually over the years. We always need more support, of course, but I think people have seen that for a small organisation, I mean, there's only 20 of us based in London in this organisation. We've been extremely effective. We provide very good value for money for people who wish to support this kind of cause, because we first of all, we convince others that are fighting similar battles to support the kind of battles that we're fighting. So I think it's a question of being able to demonstrate our effectiveness, that we're reliable, we're honest, we've got an extremely long track record of effective action, of good results. And I think that's, in a sense, I wouldn't say that we stand above other charities. That would be a wrong thing to say, but I think that we're well respected for the work that we do, and that is, I think, why people support us.
The right side of diplomatic there. So What about government help? And I'm not talking about sort of the governments that you, or the authorities you deal with abroad when you take your research and your documents to them. But I'm talking about the government here, because you are a charity that has a UK branch. You're from the UK branch. Is there any sort of cooperation? Is there any sort of link-up help that you get from the UK government?
Yes, there is actually, and our own Department for International Development, which is the part of government that deals with foreign aid programs and work in poor countries, has actually been an extremely generous supporter of the Rainforest Foundation, especially over the last 5 years or so. And all of the work that I described in terms of helping local communities map their forests in the Congo, helping get them some legal support in the field. The largest of those programs has in fact been funded by the British government through the aid program, which generally has a really quite a progressive view on how to tackle this global problem of deforestation. So we're obviously extremely thankful for that kind of support, and glad to see that in fact it's not only the Rainforest Foundation that DFID supports, but other organisations doing the similar kind of work.
Simple question. Why should I care? I mean, generally, why should I care? Because I maybe donate to other charities, home or abroad. Why should I care?
I think you should care because this is something that affects your own future. If for no other reason. The loss of species from the rainforest is something which is going to diminish the possibilities for humankind to develop new medicines, for example, in the future. I don't think any of us would like to see a future, and particularly a future for our children or our grandchildren, where gorillas have become extinct, where leopards have become extinct, where elephants have been completely hunted off the planet or had their habitat completely destroyed, where global warming has accelerated because rainforests are being destroyed. These are all things that will affect us, and I think we should care, and there are practical ways that these problems can be tackled.
Okay, we've been speaking for about 30 minutes, so if you're going to go by some reports, then I think probably around about 1,800 hectares of rainforest have been decimated, been destroyed. So maybe that's something to sort of have a think about. When you're in the field and you see that kind of thing, you see it in action, what goes through your mind?
Oh goodness, it's a complex reaction. I think. I mean, in many cases you have to say, well, this is a poor country. They are probably trying to clear land to develop agriculture. This is the kind of thing one might expect to see in these kind of countries. On the other hand, you'd have to say, well, was this damage really necessary? Could this farm, for example, have been established somewhere else, not in a rainforest area? Who is actually benefiting from this? Is it really the poor people living in these areas that are benefiting from this? Or has a wealthy foreign company maybe just grabbed this land and is exploiting it for its own profits? So I think the first thing is generally to ask questions, well, what exactly is going on here, rather than leaping to the assumption that this is necessarily a terrible thing. I think the reality is that sometimes we have to accept that not all of the world's existing rainforests are going to survive into the future. I don't think that's a likely scenario. We are almost certainly going to lose rainforests for some years to come yet. But the question is whether we can reconcile the economic development that needs to happen in countries like the Congo with protection of the environment, and how to get the balance right, and how to ensure that it's actually the local peoples, the poorest people on the planet, that are benefiting from this development, and not some other interest group. Okay.
Get your questions in for Simon Counsell from the Rainforest Foundation UK, and we'll ask him in the next few minutes. Just on the logging, I want to play devil's advocate for a minute, because it would be wrong for me not to do that. Logging palm olive production for products that we may use every day. there is an argument, and I probably know your answer to this, but there is an argument that this kind of production creates jobs. It creates an economic boost in that particular area. Is that an argument? You know,
it's partly an argument, yes, and there's no denying that in countries such as Indonesia and Malaysia, the palm oil industry has created an awful lot of jobs. The fact is that they're not particularly good jobs, it has to be said. They're often pretty poorly paid. They're quite nasty jobs. Palm oil's not a nice thing to work with. You get a lot of cuts and wounds from it, and in tropical conditions you often get badly infected. A lot of pesticides involved in it, and there's a real problem on palm oil plantations with pesticide poisoning. The living conditions in and around palm oil plantations for the workers are often pretty poor, lacking sanitation and basic services and so on. So it's employment. It's not particularly great employment. But I suppose the bigger question still is, does that really justify the expansion of palm oil in other parts of the world? And is it necessary to have those, in order to get those benefits, for pristine areas of rainforest to be destroyed, or for local people to have the land that they traditionally rely on stolen from them and given to a palm oil company? And what we would say is, no, it's not necessary to do those things. It is in theory possible for there to be a substantial expansion of the palm oil industry, because it is an extremely efficient crop. There's no doubt about that. It's some 8 times, I think, more productive than any other oil-producing plant on the planet. So, in many ways, it's a rational thing to grow. And it's extremely useful. It's extremely versatile vegetable oil as well. What we would say is, well, there are quite large areas of forest around the world, land around the world in the tropics, that have already been pretty badly degraded. They've had all the best trees removed from them. The wildlife has often been hunted to extinction. The soil is eroding because the vegetation has been removed. Well, let's look at putting those palm oil plantations in those kinds of areas rather than cutting down pristine areas of rainforest in order to plant palm trees. Let's try and do it in a way that integrates with the existing patterns of human occupation of those areas where people have rights to the land. Give people the rights to grow palm oil themselves, actually, in smaller plots. Let's develop systems in which the smallholder plantations and ways of producing palm oil can be made more efficient, using much smaller mills, for example, palm oil mills, where you actually turn the raw fruits into palm oil. That can all help to ensure that we're reconciling this demand for palm oil with protection of the environment and protection of people's rights. So there are ways of doing this, generating the jobs, and in fact generating the jobs in a much better way than the very large-scale palm oil plantations are doing at the moment. So
do you concede that there is a way that there can continue to be logging, but it needs to be managed in a different way? Is that I
think that's a different thing. I think in the kind of areas that I'm talking about, often the logging has already been done. The logging for timber, that is, so many of the best trees will already have been removed from the forest. And I mean, parts of Africa, this has been going on for 10, 30, 50 years, actually. So there are extensive areas where the forest hasn't already been badly damaged. And what we would say is that those are the kind of areas where you should be looking to plant palm oil plantations rather than the undamaged areas, pristine rainforests that still have extremely high value in terms of the wildlife that they contain and the benefits that they give to local communities.
You mentioned about wildlife. I mean, we've been talking about indigenous people, sort of the human race, but we haven't sort of really touched on that aspect. I mean, when you go into the communities that are affected, it's an ecological system as well as, I suppose, as a habitual place. So, I mean, wildlife. I mean, what kind of wildlife are we talking about So there may be a threat of extinction.
Well, in Africa, for example, in the areas that we work, famously it's the home to many of the great apes, including gorillas, the western lowland gorillas, chimpanzees, bonobos, various other kinds of monkeys. As well as forest elephants, of course, another important factor in the forest ecosystem, and especially elephants actually play an important role in helping to regenerate the forest in quite complicated ecological ways by dispersing seeds, and you get the same with some of the large birds in the Congo Basin rainforest are really important in seed dispersal, and without them the forest becomes at least different and possibly starts thinning out a little bit and becoming less complex. So one of the interesting things for us is how up until say 50 years ago, before the large-scale exploitation of Africa's rainforest really began, there were, and there still are, many millions of people living in the forest and often hunting many of those animals, but doing so in a sustainable way, in a way that they know because they will rely on the game that they're catching to exist in the future for themselves. They know how to manage wildlife, including some of the bigger creatures such as elephants, sustainably, but they've managed to do it, and the forest is as diverse as it is as a result. So there's been many people depending on the wildlife, hunting it, eating it, but still we have these very diverse ecosystems there, and so what we would look at is, well, how can we continue that into the future, recognizing that human populations are growing in those areas, and that potentially will represent a threat to this balance between humans and wildlife in the future. But there are ways of managing that. So we think that is a way forward to ensure that some of these fantastic and lovely creatures are protected well into the future.
Okay. So are there any myths around the rainforest that we might think that just are not true?
Well, I think for us the biggest myth is that there is uninhabited jungles, basically uninhabited and uninhabitable, and that's it's a myth that's been in circulation for quite a long time. They're often considered as wildernesses. It's a concept that mostly came from North America, really, where there seems to be very large areas of land that were unoccupied. Many of them got turned into the US's national park system. In fact, many of those had previously been indigenous territories and managed by indigenous communities. So that, I think, is the biggest myth that has real implications for the way that we view forests as empty places that we can somehow put a fence around and protect, and it's wrong, and it leads to the wrong kind of solutions. One of the other big ones, I think, is that the rainforests are the lungs of the planet. It's often been thought in the past that rainforests produce a lot of the oxygen that we rely on for all life to use. It's probably not true. The rainforest may produce marginally a little bit of surplus oxygen, but it also tends to consume quite a lot of oxygen. But it does store an awful lot of carbon, or carbon dioxide, which is what is released into the atmosphere when rainforests are cut down and burned, and therefore adds to the problem of climate change. So there's a couple of the big myths that we work to try and overcome. Okay.
What's the most shocking thing you've seen in the field, or maybe a member of staff?
Oh goodness, that's a really difficult one. Probably some of the devastation that I witnessed in Kenya some years ago, which had very little rainforest left, and where, as far as the eye could see, every single stick of vegetation had been removed, not just the trees, but every plant, every bush, in areas that were being given over in an entirely, as far as we could see, corrupt scheme, basically, where the government was handing out land to one particular group of party political supporters, essentially, and everybody was living in that area, and there were some indigenous forest people there, were basically being forced off, often at gunpoint, actually, to make way for this scheme to give land to government supporters. This kind of thing is pretty shocking and pretty terrible. I mean, we've experienced cases where indigenous forest people have also been treated as bushmeat. Basically, they've been shot and killed to be eaten by other members of society. These things are quite hard to confront in the field.
It kind of brings me on to the point about what indigenous people do when they're faced with a situation like this, and you may be there helping them out, or you may not have been able to reach them, and yet it comes about that this happens, that the trucks come in, that the work starts, and they're instantly in a situation where their lives are effectively turned upside down. And they may react, and may react with, sort of violence. It may come to that. I mean, what do you think about a situation there where, it's your home, you feel you've got a right to it, and you don't understand what's happening, and then it escalates. I mean,
yes, well, we are aware of cases. There have been some fairly well publicised cases in the past of where indigenous peoples have simply killed people that have tried to invade their forest lands. We believe in entirely peaceful solutions, of course. We don't support that kind of approach, but it's understandable in the sense that some tribes will do that in areas where often they may have been relatively uncontacted or completely uncontacted by outside society ever in their history. So they are, yes, extremely confused by what happens to them, very unfamiliar with the people coming into the areas, white people basically, and often faced with mortal threats to themselves. I mean, there have been many cases of where indigenous peoples have just simply been murdered to obtain their land. So yes, there are cases where indigenous peoples will fight back. Yeah, I think ultimately in some of the areas protected in Brazil, for example, it's now which has established vast areas of rainforest for indigenous peoples protection. I think it's fairly well understood by people that if you go in and try and destroy that forest or steal the land or the wood or whatever it might be, then you could face some pretty serious reactions from local communities. So, in a sense, it's an unfortunate situation. We'd rather see the rule of law prevail, of course, and we'd rather see that there are proper judicial processes where violence or murder takes place on one side or the other. But you have to understand, in many cases in these countries, these systems don't really exist very well. I mean, the court system doesn't work, the police don't work, or they might be corrupt, for example. So these are the kind of unfortunate situations where these kind of direct action, if you like, by indigenous peoples tends to happen. Okay.
So say, for example, you're sat opposite me now, but I'm the head of a construction company, and I've been told by the government I can go to this particular area and I can do my job, and I can get my workers to do my job. I mean, what would you say to me there? I'm like, well, I've been given the authority by the authority.
And it often happens in the case of palm oil companies, as we were talking about earlier on. In some cases, probably the companies that are acquiring the land for whatever purpose it might be, for timber or palm oil or building a dam or a road, they genuinely believe that the land that they are obtaining is free, it's unencumbered, it's probably uninhabited, and the government in some cases might itself genuinely believe that there's nobody there, because, as I was explaining earlier on, they often don't necessarily acknowledge that people exist in these forest areas. I think the first question the company should really ask is, well, how thoroughly has this area been surveyed in the past? When was the last time anybody was there? I mean, have you done a census to see if there's any people living in this area? Have you got information about how important this forest is environmentally? And if not, can we go and have a look before we're committing to doing anything in this area? Are there any local organisations? Are there any local organisations there that we can talk to that might represent the interests of people living in that area? I mean, those are the kind of things I would suggest to you that you should be doing, and hopefully you do that. And increasingly, companies are becoming sensitive to the fact that forests aren't uninhabited, and there are people there that may have very strong feelings about their rights to stay where they are and not have their forests destroyed around them. So I think companies are realising it's probably a sensible move to be precautious and look.
So you're finding that more companies are taking a more sort of environmental look at things nowadays. I mean,
I think that's fairly true to say. There are differences. I mean, the destruction of rainforests has been a fairly well publicised problem for at least 3 decades, I think. There are sensitivities. There have been cases in the past where some extremely large and powerful companies, extremely well recognised companies, have made mistakes, and they've paid the price for doing so. They've been embarrassed by the destruction that they've caused to rainforest areas. And I think many companies have realised that if for no other reason than that they don't want their reputations damaged in this way, they've taken a more precautious approach when working in tropical forest areas. So that's all well and good, and maybe for some of the better European, North American countries, the companies, that's the way that they would tend to work. Not always, but often that's the way that they would tend to work these days. But of course, we're seeing a massive expansion of Asian capital. Investment in countries such as the Congo and Cameroon and Gabon at the moment. South American companies themselves, of course, are extremely aggressively expanding into other parts of the tropics. So it's some of the values, I think, that are now not exactly second nature, but they're more appreciated by higher profile companies in the West, are not necessarily shared by those the new age investors and capitalists from Hong Kong, Malaysia, China, wherever it may be. So there's a way to go, I think, with ensuring that these companies are also being more precautious.
Okay, first questions coming in from viewers. The first one is, who do you basically choose to help? And kind of what considerations are made when you make that choice?
Yeah, it's a very good question. So we get many more requests for help than we can possibly satisfy, actually. I mean, I mentioned earlier on that there are many thousands of communities living in rainforest areas, most of whom are suffering from this problem of not having any real right to protect their environment. What we try and do over a period of a year or two is to explore the possibilities of working with different tribal groups, different local organisations in different countries, build up a relationship with them, and with smaller pilot efforts to get projects on the go. And over, if that works well, then over a period of years, try and build up the capacity of the local organisations to fight these kinds of battles and protect the forest. Ultimately, I think what we're looking for is cases that really can not just change what's happening in one small locality of rainforest, but also help to change the overall picture. Demonstrate that something is going wrong in that country. The law might be wrong. There might be a large company that's being allowed too much freedom to destroy rainforests. So something that's driving a national change, perhaps building a case that the law needs to change in that country. So that's one of the key things that we really look at as being where we actually offer our support, where we can be really effective, where we as a small organisation can make a big change. That's the most important thing for us.
Okay, so previously you've been talking about where you do most of your work, and it's in Africa. So this question might be where you might want to go in the future, but the question is, do you try to stop mining in Brazil and other rainforests? Is that part of your remit?
For us, no. We're part of a small network of 3 Rainforest Foundation organisations, the others being in Norway and the US. We in the UK have typically focused and traditionally focused our work mostly in Africa, but also in Peru and 1 or 2 other countries. The other Rainforest Foundation organisations have tended to work in Brazil, in Indonesia, and some of the countries that we don't work in. So we've actually not worked in Brazil. That's mostly been done by the Rainforest Foundation Norway.
Okay, so when we're talking about charities, we talk about donations, and obviously you'll know how much you get in donations. How much of that goes to the work in the field, and then how much of that goes to the bosses? Yeah,
I'm sure. Yeah, always a good question about charities. I think from last year, from our accounts, we spent it's over 90% of all the income that we got either from individual donors or from the Department for International Development or whoever it might be. Over 90% of our income was actually spent on charitable activities, so projects to describe the kinds of things that I've been doing. Of course, we have to pay staff, we have to pay our fundraisers, otherwise we couldn't raise any more funds in the future. So we have to have an office because someone's got to pay for that. We have to use the telephone and all the other things that you expect an organisation to be able to use, and that's what accounts for the other 10% or so. It's slightly less than 10% of our income, which I think by general charitable standards is pretty good. It's a pretty good ratio.
How much of that 10% do you get?
I couldn't tell you off the top of my head. I can tell you that I don't earn anything like as much as I could in the private sector.
Okay. On donations, how do you get your donations? So that, we see people out on the streets for charities, but what are the avenues that you get your donations from? We generally have a fairly kind of low-key way of getting our supporters. We do a bit of advertising. We've got an advertising campaign on the London Overground trains at the moment, asking people to donate, and they are doing so very generously. We have a good, consistent list of core supporters who give us money on a monthly or a yearly basis, and that's really important to us. We get money given to us occasionally in legacies, so it's pretty much the usual way. We do 2 or 3 special appeals each year for specific activities that we really want to raise funds for, so it's the usual way of charitable fundraising. It's an important part of being able to ensure that the organisation can develop new activities, really, and the bigger part of our funding actually does come in big grants from people like DFID for the programme activities, but the smaller donations that we get from members of the public enables us to do the new things, the kind of innovative things, the kind of slightly risky things in some cases, and the campaigning, the education work that all has to go alongside the kind of solid work in the field that we're doing with local communities. Okay. We've got time for a few more questions, and we'll get those in. Another one that's just come in is, do you ever worry that you're not going to get enough money to do your job? And this may be from donations, this may be from the government.
Yes, I worry about it. I lose sleep about it sometimes, as would any director of any charity, I think, really. We've been fortunate, I think, in that we have got increasing support over the last few years or so, and that our small but effective way of doing things has been appreciated by people, that we deliver real kind of value for people's donations. But yes, it's always hard work, especially when the approach that we take is slightly odd. It's slightly different. We're not going out there showing pictures of gorillas or orangutans or whatever it might be, saying we need to protect the rainforest in order to save these species. We're showing pictures of people living in forests, and it doesn't necessarily have that same kind of emotional resonance that it does often. But even if the end result is still pretty much the same thing, that we're getting rainforests protected. So we have a slightly different approach. In many ways, it can be a harder sell, if you like, but we're honest about what we're trying to do and how we try to do it, and we're determined to stick to that.
Okay, question coming in from Truth Hurts, who asks, what advantages are there to the UK to having rainforests?
What advantages are there to the UK to having rainforests? Well, one of the important things is, as I was mentioning earlier on, that the destruction of rainforests is contributing about 1/8 of all the greenhouse gas emissions that are causing global climate change. So if we lose all those rainforests, then global warming is going to get worse, that's for sure. So, and we should, as a small island state with a significant part of our territory not very far above sea level, including several major towns, including London, we should be concerned about climate change, and therefore should be concerned about the loss of rainforest and the difference that that is going to make. I think we could also be concerned about the large-scale demographic changes that might occur if the destruction of rainforests continues. It's been noted already in South America that the destruction of parts of the Amazon rainforest is causing the loss of important agricultural lands, not just in Brazil, but much more widely. Similar changes might well happen in Africa. If we see the destruction of forests leading to declines in agriculture, often because of the effect of drought and soil erosion happening in those countries, then this is inevitably going to create a much greater humanitarian problem in countries that in many cases are already facing major humanitarian challenges. And that, again, I think is something that we in Britain would be concerned about. Okay.
Chris asks something which you will have touched on sort of previously, but why should we care so much about an ecosystem in another country? We've kind of talked about this, but could you phrase it in a different way?
Well, sure. I was saying earlier on, I think there are two reasons for this, really. The first is a kind of one about the inherent value of wildlife, and the fact that as has been estimated in the past, possibly a half of all the wildlife species on the planet are believed to be found in rainforests. The destruction of rainforests is causing a massive pulse in species extinction. And I think from a kind of moral perspective, we would have to question whether it is acceptable that our generation and possibly the next generation will be responsible for the biggest pulse of species extinction that the planet has ever known, perhaps in many ways even worse than occurred at the time that the dinosaurs became extinct. It's that kind of scale of extinction of wildlife on the planet. Whether we think that we want to leave for future generations a planet that's been so massively depauperized of its biodiversity. That's the moral question, I think. But there's also a utilitarian issue that in the past, many rainforest species have been found to be useful in terms of a source of raw material for medicines, for industrial products, for innovative foodstuffs. And we fail to appreciate just how much of what we presently consume actually has something that once originated from the rainforest. There are many, potentially hundreds or thousands of species still out there, because there's only something like 1/10 of all the rainforest species have actually been identified, let alone studied for potential use for science. We're losing those species faster than we can actually identify what possible use they might have in the future for human being. Recognizing that we're facing new threats. Is there something out there, for example, that may be useful in treating Ebola? Well, we simply don't know. In the past, we found that there are important species that can be helpful in treating some forms of cancer, for example, and many other kinds of afflictions. So we're almost kind of burning this vast library of knowledge before we've even read any of the books, and I think that is one of the reasons, one of the key reasons why we should be concerned about the species loss because of rainforest destruction.
Okay. Question from Revolution who asks, how can humans and the environment basically adapt and live in harmony better?
Yes, it's a very good question. From our perspective, I think it has a lot to do with recognising people's rights. We take it for granted in this country that we have rights that will project into the future, and typically when we know that we have something that is securely ours, we tend to protect it. We look after it. It's quite simple. That isn't the case for many people living in tropical rainforest areas. They simply don't have this right of ownership, this right of possession of their local environment. You know, even the patch of forest that they depend on to grow their food in, for example. If people can be trusted, if you like, to have the rights to protect that area, then I think they generally will do. Not always, but they mostly will do. So the recognition of rights, I think, of forest people is one of the very first things we have to do to kind of build that balance, if you like, between human well-being and the need to protect the rainforest environment. Okay.
Another question from a viewer. This is quite an interesting one, actually. In some rainforests, there are rebels. How do you deal with that? Has there ever been a case where you've had to deal with something like that?
Yes, indeed. And right at the moment, we have had to suspend all of the work that we were doing in the Central African Republic, which some of the viewers might know was overrun by rebels last year, unfortunately, and stopped progress on a very promising project there, which potentially could have gone a long way to helping secure forest people's rights and protect much of the rainforest in the Central African Republic. That unfortunately has all been disrupted and stopped. It seems that we often work in conflict areas, actually, and it's often the case that these remote areas tend to be the hideouts for rebel groups, areas of conflict where natural resources are being fought over, and often it's the indigenous communities that are getting caught up in these kinds of struggles. The area that we've worked in Peru for the last 15 years or so, in fact we started working there because they had suffered terrible depredations at the hands of the Shining Path rebel movement, which had destroyed almost a half of the entire Ashaninka native population in that area, trying to grab their land basically for cocaine production and other nefarious activities. So we were helping to rebuild the Ashaninka people there after they had suffered this loss at the hands of terrorist groups. There are still threats in their area. Nearly 20 years later, there are still challenges. So these are difficult places to work in many cases. Yes.
And with the situation with CAR that you had to pull out of,
yeah.
I mean, were you pulling out before you were in the middle of anything because you knew about it, or?
Yes, I mean, in terms of our own staff visiting and working in the country, the warning signs were there, and we have to have a pretty precautious approach to the safety of our staff, and we stopped going there actually shortly before the actual coup and the rebel takeover happened. Unfortunately, and this is where we have to respect the bravery of the local people that we work with. It wasn't so happy for the local partner organisations that we work there, who actually lost a couple of members of staff in some of the civil violence that occurred once the rebel takeover had actually happened, which was a tragic loss for us and, of course, for our local partner organisations there. This is unfortunately a fairly common occurrence, and people fighting to save rainforests are losing their lives almost on a weekly basis. Only a couple of days ago, 4 people native people in Peru, who'd been trying to resist the invasion of their lands by illegal timber companies were murdered by timber companies, by those illegal loggers. So there's been a high toll rate of people trying to protect rainforests, yes.
Something we've touched on, we'll get a couple more questions. So something we've touched on, you get funding from the government here. But how, and this is a slight change on a viewer question just because we've had it before, but you get government funding, but do you lobby them for more? You know, is there an avenue for that? Because obviously, I'm sure you would want more.
I wouldn't say that we lobby them for more. We believe it's an important issue, obviously. The government of the UK is committed to spending a certain amount of money on protecting rainforests, particularly as a part of its commitment to trying to prevent climate change and some of the causes of climate change that are occurring not here in Britain or Europe, but in developing countries, and deforestation is one of those causes. So the British government has committed to spending money on in trying to prevent that. We're fortunate enough to be a recipient of some of that money. We'd like to see generally probably more of that money being spent for that kind of purpose. But on the other hand, you know, I think we're fairly realistic about this, and in our experience of working with these kind of frontline projects, if you like, to protect rainforests, we're also very much aware that throwing money at the problem isn't the solution. There's only so much money can actually be absorbed in many of these countries that have extremely weak institutions. The government agencies are very poorly run. There are insufficient kind of expert or trained staff that can do work for environmental protection agencies in the Congo, for example. We need to, in many cases, start with kind of fairly small scale initiatives and build these up over a number of years. So in many ways, we think the balance is probably about right at the moment. We don't think that a huge expansion of funding for tropical rainforest protection is necessarily a good thing. It's doing things at a small scale, trying new ideas, getting them working properly, and then building on those that we think is the right way forward.
Okay, 2 more questions. One from Debater, who asks, what is the Foundation's stance on global warming and ice caps? And then following on from that, is it all in vain?
Oh goodness, global warming and ice caps. I don't know that I'm not really qualified to speak on that. I mean, clearly the loss of that we saw of the North Pole ice cover last year, which I believe was more extensive than it's ever been in the past, would seem to be an indication that things are definitely changing in the atmosphere, and quite what consequences this is going to happen are rather unpredictable. I mean, there are climate scientists that have much better answers for this than I could possibly have. I mean, what we would say is that we have to do what we can to prevent the causes of that we can influence, and preventing destruction of rainforests is one of them.
Okay.
So there was a second part to the question as well, wasn't there?
Is it all in vain?
Is it all? Oh, is it?
Whatever we do, sort of, tackling logging, not chopping down trees, not using products that are parts of the
Sure.
trees.
Well, it's made a difference in the past. We've not won every battle, for sure, but I mentioned earlier on in this discussion that we played a really important role in helping to stop a massive expansion of the timber industry in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And we could have seen millions and millions of acres of land given out to timber companies. We as a small organisation working with a couple of other small organisations and local groups have basically stopped that. So you can win these battles, but we're not going to win them all. And I have to say that at the moment, given the global inaction on climate change and the failure to come to a really legally binding global agreement on preventing climate change is really a cause for concern. I mean, you'd have to say at the moment we're losing the battle against climate change, yes, and this could have terrible, terrible consequences in the future.
Final question. Is there any chance of an unknown disease or fungus being brought back from a rainforest to the UK?
Yes, there is. I would have to say probably not by our staff, but yes, these. I mean, as we've seen with the awful situation with Ebola recently, there are often, because of the increased interactions between humans and wildlife going on in areas of forest where the forest is being destroyed, basically, there has been a noted increase in the transmission of disease from animals to humans over the last few decades. The projections that I've seen suggest that this could continue on in the future. We'd have to expect that there are going to be new diseases being transmitted to humans where we're in these areas of forest where new wildlife is being encountered, new diseases are evolving, and so on and so forth. So yeah, there's a risk, but there's a risk of that happening from anybody, I think, that travels from these areas where new diseases are developing, not just from rainforest areas.
Okay. Well, I think we'll wrap it up there. Thank you to Simon Counsell from the Rainforest Foundation UK, talking to us about mapping rights, indigenous people, and the effects of logging and other practices. We have more live interviews next week. Monday we talk to Jo Twist, who is the CEO of the UK Interactive Entertainment. She'll talk to us about women in gaming, and a couple of members of the Free Tibet organisation will come and see us on Tuesday. So until then, we'll see you till next time.